When Father Michael Hartley stood at the edge of St. Mary's Churchyard on a cold March morning in 1350 and realized that the small medieval cemetery, which had served the parish for 300 years, would need to be expanded by half again to accommodate the dead of just the past 6 months, he understood that he was witnessing not just personal tragedies, but the unraveling of the world he had known his entire life. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. St. Mary stood in the village of Ashworth, a small community in the Yorkshire Dales that had, before the plague, been home to perhaps 400 souls. The church itself dated to the 11th century, a solid Norman structure with thick stone walls and small windows that admitted light in shafts that moved across the nave according to the season and the time of day. Father Michael had served this church for 18 years, since he'd been ordained at 25 and assigned to Ashworth by the bishop, expecting to spend perhaps a few years in this rural parish before being called to more significant work elsewhere. But he'd stayed. He'd fallen in love with the place, with the village and its people, with the particular quality of light in the Yorkshire hills, with the rhythm of the agricultural year that shaped everything about parish life, with the deep satisfaction of knowing his congregation intimately, of being present for births and marriages and deaths, of serving the same families year after year, watching children grow and marry and have children of their own. The churchyard had been adequate for the village's needs throughout the time Father Michael had served there. Deaths occurred, of course, elderly people reaching the end of natural life, women dying in childbirth, children succumbing to fevers or accidents, the occasional adult taken by illness or injury. The churchyard had expanded gradually over the centuries, graves added in orderly rows, the oldest stones near the church walls now weathered and illegible, the newest near the edges where there was still room for more, until the plague had come in the autumn of 1349, carried to Ashworth by a traveling peddler who'd arrived in the village feeling unwell and who'd died 3 days later in the inn, before anyone understood what he'd brought with him. Within a week, 5 more people were dead. Within a month, half the village was sick. By Christmas, more than 100 people had died, and the deaths continued through the winter, slowing only as spring approached and the weather warmed. Father Michael had buried them all, or nearly all. There had been a few days in November when the dying had come so fast that he'd been forced to conduct mass burials, blessing multiple bodies at once, rather than giving each person the individual funeral rites they deserved. The memory of those days haunted him, the cart piled with bodies, the grave digger working frantically to prepare trenches large enough to hold them, the living standing at a distance, terrified to come too close, watching as their family members and neighbors were lowered into the earth with a haste that felt disrespectful, but which was necessary simply to keep pace with the deaths. The old section of the churchyard was full now, every available space between existing graves occupied by new ones. The expansion Father Michael contemplated would take the churchyard into the adjacent field, land that belonged to the church, but which had been used for grazing, the church's small flock of sheep, keeping the grass short and providing wool for sale. The sheep would have to be moved. A wall would need to be built to enclose the new section, and the ground would need to be consecrated before it could receive the dead. Father Michael stood at the edge of the field, looking at the space that would become graves, and he felt the weight of what he was seeing, not just the practical task of expansion, but what it represented. This village had lost a quarter of its population in 6 months. Families had been destroyed, trades left without practitioners, houses standing empty. The social fabric that had held the community together for generations had been torn, and Father Michael didn't know if it could be mended, if Ashworth would survive as a functioning village, or if it would slowly dissolve, the survivors drifting away to places that hadn't been so devastated. He turned back to look at the existing churchyard, at the rows of fresh graves marked by simple wooden crosses that would eventually be replaced by stone markers for those families who could afford them. He knew everyone buried there, knew their names and their faces, knew their stories. Agnes the baker, who'd made the bread for the village for 30 years, who died leaving no one to continue her work. Thomas the blacksmith, whose 3 sons had all died before him, leaving no one to inherit his forge. Margaret, who'd taught Father Michael to read Yorkshire dialect when he'd first arrived from the south, who'd been kind and patient with a young priest, finding his way in an unfamiliar place. And the children, so many children. The plague had taken them in terrible numbers, 27 children under the age of 10, buried in the small section of the churchyard that had always been reserved for the youngest. Their graves were marked with small crosses, many decorated with simple carvings or painted with bright colors by grieving parents who wanted their children's resting places to reflect the joy the children had brought to life, not just the sorrow of their deaths. Father Michael walked among the graves, reading the names on the markers, saying a prayer at each one, a practice he developed in the months since the plague's arrival. He couldn't save them, couldn't bring them back, couldn't undo what had been done, but he could remember them, could speak their names, could ensure that each person who died was acknowledged individually, was mourned as the specific person they'd been, and not just as one more victim in the overwhelming tide of death. This practice had become his own form of grief management, his way of processing losses that were too numerous and too rapid to be properly mourned in real time. When the dying had been at its worst, Father Michael had moved through his duties in a kind of numb efficiency, conducting last rites and burial services without fully feeling what was happening, simply doing what needed to be done because someone had to do it. But now, as the pace of deaths slowed and he had time to reflect, the grief was catching up with him. He would stand in the churchyard and suddenly be overwhelmed by the memory of a particular person, the way Agnes had laughed, the care Thomas had taken in his work, the brightness of Margaret's mind, and the loss would strike him with a force that took his breath away. He'd been trained in theology and the intellectual frameworks that explained suffering and death as part of divine plan, as tests of faith or punishments for sin, or mysterious workings of providence that humans couldn't fully understand. But those frameworks felt inadequate now, felt like abstractions that didn't match the concrete reality of all these graves, all these specific people who'd been loved and who were now gone. What did it mean to say this was God's will? That a third of the village, including 27 children, had died as part of some inscrutable divine purpose. Father Michael believed in God, believed in the fundamental truths of his faith, but he struggled to reconcile those beliefs with what he'd witnessed, with the randomness of who had died and who had lived, with the suffering of people who'd been good and faithful, and who died in agony nonetheless. He knelt at one of the small graves, a girl named Emma, who'd been 7 years old, who'd loved singing, who died in December, asking her mother when she could go back to church to sing with the choir again. Father Michael had promised her had said she'd be back singing soon, not wanting to frighten her with the truth that she was dying. He'd thought then that the small lie was a kindness, but he regretted it now, wondered if he should have been honest, should have prepared her somehow for what was coming. "I'm sorry, Emma," he said quietly, his hand on the small wooden cross that marked her grave. "I'm sorry I lied to you. I'm sorry you died. I'm sorry for all of it." The apology felt both necessary and futile. Emma couldn't hear him, was beyond the reach of his words or his regret. But he said it anyway, needing to speak the acknowledgment aloud, needing to admit that he'd failed, that his promises hadn't been kept, that he hadn't protected his flock as a shepherd should. Father Michael stood and continued his circuit of the graves, speaking quietly to the dead, telling them he remembered them, that they mattered, that their lives hadn't been meaningless even though they'd been cut short. It had become a daily practice, this walking among the graves, and it grounded him, kept him connected to the specific reality of individual loss, rather than letting it all blur into abstract tragedy. As he walked, he noticed John Carpenter working at the far edge of the churchyard, preparing the ground for the expansion. John was one of the survivors, a man in his 40s who'd lost his wife and 2 of his 3 children to the plague, but who'd somehow kept working, kept functioning, kept doing the tasks that needed doing even as his world fell apart around him. Father Michael approached him. "John, how are you managing?" John looked up from his work, his face showing the exhaustion that everyone who'd survived carried these days. "Well enough, Father. Getting the ground ready for consecration, as you asked." "And Alice?" Alice was John's surviving daughter, a girl of 12 who'd become very quiet after her mother and siblings died, who spent most of her time sitting in her family's house, barely speaking, barely eating. "The same, Father. I don't know how to reach her. She's gone somewhere inside herself where I can't follow." Father Michael nodded. He'd seen this in several of the survivors, particularly children, a retreat into silence and stillness, as if they'd decided that engaging with the world was too dangerous, too painful, and that withdrawing was safer than remaining present. "I'll visit her again. Perhaps tomorrow." "Thank you, Father." John returned to his work, and Father Michael walked back toward the church, thinking about Alice and about all the other survivors who were struggling with losses they didn't know how to process, with griefs too large to be contained in the forms and rituals that had traditionally managed such things. The church itself felt emptier than it once had. Before the plague, Sunday Mass had filled the nave, people standing in the back because there wasn't enough room on the benches, voices raised in hymns that resonated off the stone walls. Now perhaps 150 people came to Mass, and the space felt cavernous around them, the absence of the dead as palpable as the presence of the living. Father Michael tried to address this in his homilies, tried to find words that would comfort and strengthen and make sense of what had happened. But he struggled with the preaching now, found himself questioning the conventional wisdom and traditional formulations that he'd learned in seminary, and that had served him well for 18 years, but which now felt inadequate. How do you preach about God's love to people who've watched their children die? How do you talk about divine providence to a man who's lost his entire family? How do you explain that this was all part of God's plan when the plan seems incomprehensible and cruel? Father Michael had always believed that faith meant trusting in God's goodness, even when you couldn't understand God's actions. But he found his own faith tested now, found himself lying awake at night, wrestling with questions he couldn't answer, doubts he couldn't resolve. He prayed for guidance, for clarity, for some sign that what he was doing mattered, that his presence and his work were helping his congregation through this catastrophe. But he received no clear answers, just the ongoing necessity of performing his duties, of being present, of continuing to serve even when he felt lost himself. In the weeks that followed, the churchyard expansion proceeded. John Carpenter and several other men prepared the new section, removing rocks, leveling the ground, building a low stone wall to enclose it. Father Michael performed the consecration ceremony, walking the boundaries of the new space with holy water and prayers, blessing the ground to receive the Christian dead, transforming ordinary field into sacred burial space. The first burial in the new section was for Richard Miller, an elderly man who'd survived the plague but who died in early April of what seemed to be simple old age. His heart had given out in his sleep, a peaceful death that felt almost like a gift after all the plague deaths that had been anything but peaceful. Father Michael conducted the funeral service, and Richard's family reduced, now to just a son and a daughter-in-law. Everyone else, having died in the plague, stood at the graveside in the new section and watched as their patriarch became the first to be buried in this expansion that represented both the village's devastation and its continuing life. After Richard's burial, Father Michael stood alone in the new section and looked back at the original churchyard, at the hundreds of graves that marked 3 centuries of Ashworth's dead, at the fresh graves that marked the 6 months of plague. The old section and the new section together held the village's entire history of death, the accumulated loss of generations, each grave representing a life lived and a life mourned, a presence that had become an absence, but that remained connected to the living through memory and grief, and the ongoing practice of tending to the grave and speaking the names of the departed. He thought about the nature of churchyards, about what they represented. They were obviously practical places to put the bodies of the dead, to remove them from the spaces of the living for sanitary and psychological reasons. But they were also symbolic, sacred spaces that marked the boundary between life and death, that insisted the dead remained part of the community, even in their separation from it, that maintained the connection between the living and their ancestors through the physical presence of the graves and the regular visitation that tending them required. In normal times, the churchyard expanded slowly, a grave at a time, the addition of each new marker a sad but expected event in the life of the community. But the plague had forced a rapid expansion, had transformed the churchyard from a space that changed gradually over generations to one that had grown dramatically in just months, visible evidence of catastrophe, of loss on a scale that the community had never experienced and didn't know how to process. Father Michael walked back to the church, entered the cool stone interior, and knelt before the altar to pray. He'd been praying constantly since the plague had arrived for the sick, for the dying, for the survivors, for guidance and strength and understanding. His knees ached from all the kneeling. His voice was hoarse from all the prayers and last rites and funeral services. His heart was heavy with all the grief and doubt and exhaustion. Lord, he prayed, help me to serve these people. Help me to find words that comfort, to offer presence that strengthens, to be for them what they need even when I don't know what that is. And help me to understand, if understanding is possible, what this all means, why this has happened, what I meant to do with my own grief and doubt and fear. He knelt there for a long time, waiting for some response, some sense of divine presence or guidance. What he felt eventually was not any clear answer, but simply a calm, a quieting of the questions, a sense that perhaps understanding wasn't the point, that perhaps what was required was simply continuing to serve, continuing to be present, continuing to perform the rituals and duties that held the community together, even when they didn't provide clear answers or easy comfort. He rose from his knees and went to his small residence attached to the church, where he lived alone with his books and his prayers and his daily struggles with faith and doubt. He lit a fire against the evening chill and sat with a book of hours, reading the appointed prayers for the day, letting the familiar words carry him through the structure of monastic time that had always grounded his life even here in a parish setting. There was a knock at the door. Father Michael answered to find Mary Fletcher, a widow in her 50s who'd lost her 2 sons to the plague, but who'd survived herself and who'd been helping to care for some of the other survivors who were struggling. She looked worried. "Father, it's Alice Carpenter. She's not eating, hasn't eaten in 3 days. John asked if you could come, if you might be able to help." Father Michael followed Mary to the Carpenter house, a modest structure near the center of the village that felt too large now for the 2 people who remained in it. John met them at the door, his face drawn with worry. "She's in her room, Father. Won't come out, won't talk to me. I'm afraid I'm losing her, that she's giving up." Father Michael climbed the stairs to Alice's small room, knocked gently, and entered when there was no response. Alice sat on her bed, her knees drawn up to her chest, staring at the wall. She was thin, too thin, and she didn't acknowledge Father Michael's presence. He sat on a chair near the bed, not trying to force interaction, just being present in the room with her. After a long silence, he spoke quietly. "Alice, I know you're hurting. I know the pain of what you've lost is so great that it feels like nothing matters anymore, like there's no point in eating or talking or doing anything, because the people you loved are gone, and you don't know how to be in the world without them." Alice didn't respond, but Father Michael thought he saw the slightest shift in her posture, an indication that she was listening. "I can't take away your pain," he continued. "I wish I could, but I can't. What I can tell you is that your mother and your brother and sister loved you, and they would want you to live. Not to forget them, you'll never forget them, and you shouldn't, but to live, to grow up, to have the life they can't have anymore." Still no response, but Alice's eyes moved slightly, shifted from the wall to Father Michael's face, just for a moment, before returning to the wall. "You don't have to be all right," Father Michael said. "You don't have to stop grieving or pretend you're fine. But you do have to eat. You have to let your father take care of you. He's lost so much, too, and he needs you. You're all he has left, and you're important, you're valuable, you're worth caring for, even when you don't feel like you are." He sat with her for perhaps half an hour more, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent, simply being present in the room, being another human who acknowledged her grief, without trying to fix it or minimize it or rush her through it. Finally, he stood. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said, "and I'll bring some bread from my own kitchen. I'd like you to eat it, not for me, but for your mother who loved you and who would want you to live." He left the room, spoke briefly with John, promised to return, and walked back to the church through the spring evening, the light fading but still illuminating the hills around Ashworth with a gentle gold that made everything beautiful, despite the grief that saturated this place. Over the following days, Father Michael visited Alice daily, sometimes sitting with her in silence, sometimes talking about her mother and siblings, encouraging her to share memories, to speak about what she'd lost. Gradually, very gradually, Alice began to respond, began to speak a few words, began to accept small amounts of food. The healing was slow and incomplete. She remained quiet, withdrawn, clearly marked by her losses. But she was eating again, was engaging with her father again, was moving back toward life, even if that movement was tentative and uncertain. Father Michael found this work, the individual pastoral care, the attention to specific people in their specific struggles, more satisfying than the larger theological questions that he still couldn't resolve. He couldn't explain why the plague had happened or what divine purpose it served, but he could sit with a grieving child, could encourage her to eat, could be present in her suffering without trying to explain it away or minimize it. That felt real and valuable in a way that abstract theological reasoning did not. As spring moved toward summer, the pace of deaths slowed further. There were still occasional plague cases, but far fewer than in the terrible months of autumn and winter. The village began to stabilize at its new reduced population, the survivors adapting to the reality of their changed community, beginning to rebuild social structures and economic arrangements that had been destroyed by the death of so many. But the churchyard continued to be a visible reminder of what had been lost. Father Michael walked among the graves daily, maintaining his practice of speaking to the dead, ensuring that the newest graves were properly tended, that the markers remained readable, that nothing was forgotten or neglected. He noticed that others were doing the same, family members visiting graves, pulling weeds, leaving small tokens of remembrance, maintaining the connection between the living and their dead. On Sundays after Mass, people would linger in the churchyard, standing at graves and sharing memories, telling stories about the departed, keeping their names and personalities alive through the act of remembrance. Father Michael encouraged this, began to build time into the Sunday schedule for this informal memorial practice, recognizing that the community needed these opportunities to honor their dead collectively, to share grief and memory in ways that individual mourning couldn't accomplish. One Sunday in late May, an elderly woman named Grace approached Father Michael in the churchyard. She'd lost her husband and all 3 of her children to the plague and was now living with a cousin, the last surviving member of her immediate family. "Father," she said, "I wanted to ask you something. The graves are filling up the old churchyard, and now the new section. What happens when we run out of space? When there's no more room for the dead?" Father Michael had been thinking about this question himself. At the rate burials were occurring, not just plague deaths now, but normal deaths from age and illness and accident, the expanded churchyard might have room for another decade or two, but eventually it would fill. And then what? "I suppose we'd expand again," he said. "Take in more of the adjacent field, consecrate more ground. The church owns enough land that we could probably expand for several generations before running into real limits." Grace nodded slowly. "So the churchyard will just keep growing, keep taking up more space until the whole world is graves?" Father Michael smiled gently at this hyperbole, but he understood what Grace was getting at, the sense that death was overtaking life, that the space of the dead was expanding faster than the space of the living, that something fundamental had been disrupted by the plague's devastation. "The churchyard grows as it needs to," Father Michael said. "It's always grown slowly, usually, but it's always grown. That's part of being human, part of being mortal. We die, and we need places to put our dead, places to remember them. The churchyard's expansion is sad. especially now when it's expanding so rapidly. But it's also natural, necessary. It's part of how we honor the dead and maintain our connection to them. But it hurts, Grace said quietly. Walking through here, seeing all these graves, knowing who's buried in each one. It hurts so much. I know, Father Michael said. It hurts me too. Every day, they stood together in the churchyard, surrounded by the graves of people they'd known and loved. And Father Michael thought about the nature of memory and mourning, and the way communities hold their grief collectively. The churchyard was a physical space, but it was also an emotional and spiritual space, a place where the boundary between life and death was acknowledged but also, in some sense, transgressed, where the living could come to feel close to their dead, to maintain relationships that death had interrupted but not entirely ended. That summer, Father Michael began a new practice. On the first Sunday of each month, he conducted a special memorial service in which he read aloud the names of everyone who'd been buried in St. Mary's Churchyard in the previous month. The list was often long 10 or 12 names in the plague months, fewer now, but still a steady stream of deaths from the usual causes of mortality. He read each name clearly, giving each person a moment of acknowledgement, a public recognition of their death and their importance to the community. And after reading the names, he invited anyone in the congregation to share a memory of any of the departed, to tell a story or describe a quality, or simply say aloud what the person had meant to them. These services became important to the community, a monthly opportunity for collective mourning and remembrance, a formal acknowledgement that loss was ongoing, that grief didn't end, but needed to be incorporated into the rhythms of continuing life. People came to rely on these services, on the opportunity to speak about their dead, to hear others speak about them, to know that the deaths were being marked and remembered not just individually, but communally. Father Michael found these services exhausting, but also strangely sustaining. Hearing people's memories and stories brought the dead back to life momentarily, reminded him of who they'd been beyond just their names on grave markers, helped him understand why their losses mattered so much and why the work of remembering them was so important. As summer moved toward autumn, the first autumn since the plague had arrived, Father Michael prepared for the anniversary of the first deaths. He'd been thinking about how to mark this anniversary, how to acknowledge the year that had passed, how to help the community process the accumulation of losses that had transformed Ashworth from a thriving village into a depleted one struggling to survive. He decided to conduct a special service on the anniversary of the peddler's death, the man who'd brought the plague to Ashworth, and who'd been, in a sense, the first victim, even though no one had understood at the time what he'd died from. Father Michael had buried him in an unmarked grave at the edge of the churchyard, and he now decided to place a marker there, acknowledging this man whose name had been forgotten, but whose arrival had changed everything. The marker reads simply, "Here lies a traveler who died September 1349. He was a child of God. May he rest in peace." On the anniversary itself, Father Michael conducted a service of remembrance for all who died in the plague year. He read every name, more than 100 of them, giving each person their moment of acknowledgement. And then he invited the congregation to come forward and light candles, one candle for each person they'd lost, until the front of the church was filled with flickering lights, 100 points of flame representing the 100 dead, the darkness pushed back by their collective glow. The service was silent after the candle lighting, everyone sitting with their grief and their memories. The candlelight creating shadows that moved on the church walls, the presence of the dead almost palpable in the hushed space. Father Michael stood at the altar and looked at his congregation, at the survivors who'd made it through the worst year of their lives and who were now trying to figure out how to continue, how to build lives in the wake of catastrophe, how to honor the dead while still living. "We remember," he said finally, breaking the silence. "We remember those who died. We speak their names. We light candles for them. We tend their graves. We tell their stories. This is what we can do. This is what we must do to keep them with us, to insist that their lives mattered, that their deaths matter, that they remain part of us even in their absence." He paused, looking at the candles, at the faces of his congregation illuminated by their warm light. "And we continue. We continue to live, to work, to marry and have children, to plant and harvest, to celebrate and mourn, to be the community we've always been, even though we're smaller now, even though we carry losses that will never fully heal. We continue because we must, because life requires it, because the dead would want us to, because there's no other choice that honors what we've been through." The congregation sat with these words, and then slowly people began to leave, each taking their candle with them, carrying the light out into the autumn darkness, the flames flickering in the night breeze, 100 small lights dispersing into the village, into the homes and the streets, into the ongoing life that persisted despite everything. Father Michael extinguished the remaining candles at the altar, locked the church, and walked to the churchyard, where he stood among the graves in the darkness, looking at the shapes of the markers barely visible in the starlight. The churchyard had expanded, would continue to expand as death continued, as it always did, as it always would. But that expansion was not defeat, was not evidence that death had won. It was evidence that life continued, that communities persisted, that memory was maintained, that the dead were honored, and the living carried on. He knelt at one of the graves, Agnes the baker's, the woman who'd made bread for the village for 30 years, and he spoke quietly into the darkness. "Thank you for the bread, Agnes. Thank you for your kindness and your skill, and your presence in this village. You're missed. You're remembered. You matter still." And then he rose and walked back to his small residence, where he would pray the evening office and sleep and rise to pray again at dawn, continuing the rhythm of monastic time that structured his days, continuing to serve his devastated but surviving congregation, continuing to expand the churchyard as needed, continuing to remember and honor the dead while supporting the living, continuing because continuing was the work, was the calling, was what faith required even when understanding remained elusive and grief was overwhelming and the future was uncertain. The churchyard expands, the names accumulate, the graves fill with the bodies of the beloved dead, and the living continue, carrying their losses, tending the graves, speaking the names, lighting the candles, insisting through the simple act of remembrance that death does not have the final word, that love persists beyond loss, that memory is sacred work, that the expansion of the churchyard is not just about death, but about the continuing relationship between the living and the dead, the way communities hold their history and their grief and their identity across generations, marking the earth with the evidence that people lived here, loved here, died here, and mattered enough to be remembered.